Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my final verdict on the new Sigma 35mm F1.2 DN lens. So this is designed for full-frame mirrorless. I've reviewed it on Sony FE. There's also a Leica L version available, and it is in their Art series. This is one of a trio of 3 new lenses that Sigma has quickly both released, or first announced then released, for these full-frame mirrorless platforms, and represents their first dedicated design specifically for full-frame mirrorless. Now, they have had DN lenses previously that were designed for E-mount APS-C, but now they've gone full bore into the full frame. And unlike last year's kind of reconstituted lenses that they released in FE, but they were existing versions of some of their DSLR lenses, these represent dedicated design. This is also the first f1.2 autofocus lens, to my knowledge, it's available for the Sony FE platform. And so it is a significant lens. Now, it's also the most art-like in terms of it being very large, very heavy, and in fact, we took a close look at the design, the specifications, the build in a first look episode that you can take a look at here. Some of the highlights of that, and I'll just skim those, is that this is obviously, it's physically large. This is 1,090 grams. It is 136 millimeters or 5.36 inches long. And so as you can see, as I've brought out the Samyang 35mm F1.4, also a lens designed for Sony FE, you can see that although the Samyang was considered a fairly large lens, about the same size as the Sony Zeiss 35mm F1.4, you can see that it's pretty much dwarfed by the size of the Sigma. And I think that this probably represents pretty much the largest 35mm lens that I've ever personally used or tested. And it's even larger than like the Zeiss Milvis for DSLRs. It's also f1.2. And so it does go into a little bit wider territory than what I'm accustomed to as well. But as you can see, it is physically large, it is heavy. However, it is beautifully built, thorough weather sealing throughout the body, very high grade of build, and very feature rich. Very much like the GM lenses in that it gives you an option of using either a manual aperture ring or to auto use the aperture. But beyond that, it also has a declicking, and so you can do smooth aperture racking for video work. Like a lot of Sony lenses, it does have the autofocus hold button that can be programmed for a variety of functions in the camera body, and it has a dedicated AF/MF switch, which is always nice to have. And it has a nicely damped, a little bit heavy, but nicely damped and precise focus ring. The lens hood is very nicely made. It has a lock on it, and it has an 82mm front filter thread up front, and not only a gasket at the rear, but internal seals throughout the design. It's got 11 rounded aperture blades, which helps to keep the aperture nice and round. And in fact, I found that it was better than competing lenses when it came to geometry along the edges of the frame. Just a little bit better wide open, but as you stop down, it did a better job of, even by f2, basically having circular shapes all across the frame, which is a big deal for some people, particularly if they're shooting with, Christmas lights or something very bright, and they want that, kind of equal geometry, roundness across the frame. But as you continue to stop the lens down, it does a great job of retaining a circular aperture due to having those additional aperture blades and having them nicely curved. And so kudos to them on that front. This lens is fairly expensive. It's running very up close to the Sony Zeiss Distagon, and so it comes in at $1,499, so represents one of the more expensive Sigma lenses that's currently on the market and on telephoto or super telephoto. And so, but as far as the build and the handling, other than it being large and heavy, I found that it handled very, very nicely. I personally love having a manual aperture ring. I tend to use it when I have it, and I think it causes me to be a little bit more deliberate about my selection of aperture in a way that's really important to me. Speaking of aperture, in a second episode, we took a look at the image quality from the lens. And what I found is that the Sigma is as sharp in the center of the frame at f1.2 as what lenses like the Samyang or the Canon. Another one that I compared it to is the Canon EF 35mm f1.2L Mark II, one of what I consider to be one of the very best 35mm lenses. And what I found is that the Sigma was as sharp at f1.2 in the center of the frame as what those lenses were, and sharper at the edges and the corners of the frame at f1.2 than those lenses were at f1.4. And that remains true. It's not until smaller apertures around f2.8 and smaller where the Samyang catches up in the corners, and probably not really fully until like landscape apertures of f4 and f5.6. And so, I mean, if you value sharpness across the frame, that's a priority for you, then certainly it proves its strength in that. It also proves its strength in being very, very sharp and great contrast at f1.2 in a variety of focus situations and focus distances, which is key. I've noted in a lot of wide aperture primes, particularly in the past, that they might be fairly well corrected at, say, portrait distances, kind of their primary reason of existence. But if you move them out to landscape apertures or close focus distances, the image quality wasn't as good in those situations. It can focus down fairly close and has a very usable 0.19 times magnification. But I mean, incredibly sharp at f1.2, sharp enough that you can shoot, should you so desire, you can shoot landscapes at that, you can shoot astrophotography at that. And what I found is that it's very good in the center of the frame. There is some coma out in the corners of the frame, along the edges of the frame, that you start to get where they look a little bit, stars look a little bit like flying insects. But I would still, if I own this lens, I would still probably use it for astro at times, for the simple reason you can suck up an incredible amount of light at f1.2. And so I found I was shooting night sky images, shooting at only like ISO 400 and shooting exposures of like 4 seconds, which the great thing about that is that you eliminate any risk of star movement, which at 35mm you would start to detect even probably by a 15-second exposure. And so that's certainly a plus there. Great contrast throughout the lens. The bokeh quality is good. In fact, it's better in many situations than the Samyang. And the only area where the Samyang I think is as good or maybe better is it maybe just in the kind of the color and the rendering of the defocused areas can be good, but they also can be a little bit busier than what the Sigma. Sigma does a great job of keeping things nice and soft, even at equivalent apertures. And so that f1.2 aperture does give you a lot more creative options. At say an 85mm focal length, f1.2 is such a tiny, tiny depth of field that there are a lot of situations where it's really actually impractical to use. I find with a 35mm lens, however, having that extra bit of aperture actually opens up a lot of extra creative options and gives you more separation from the background when you're shooting, even with, say, full body type distance of portraits. And so as you can see from these at f1.2, even though it's an environmental portrait, there's still some separation from the background, which is kind of uniquely caused by the f1.2 aperture. When it comes to the autofocus, I found that the autofocus accuracy was excellent with the lens. I shot a lot of portraits, for example, and event shots at f1.2, and I got, basically I'm not aware of any misses that I got. Autofocus, eye detect worked very, very well, did a great job with that, and so I was very, very pleased with autofocus accuracy throughout the extent of my review. Autofocus is quiet. It's not as quiet as what, say, the 45mm f2.8 was. However, it's quiet enough that you're hardly going to notice it in most situations. Now, one exception to that may be when it comes to video, and that video focus pulls. It's there's a stepping motor there, and unfortunately you can actually really see the steps. Let's take a look at, my kind of standard focus pull video, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So as you can see, as you transition, particularly a distant focus pull, you can actually see kind of the focus stepping its way out. And so obviously that's not optimal. If you're wanting to do big focus pulls, there are certainly smoother ways of accomplishing than that. And so for video work, we'll take a look at some footage here. But for video, I mean, the footage itself looks beautiful. No complaints when it comes to that. The only thing that I would say, obviously, is that if you're wanting to do major focus pulls, it's not going to be the smoothest lens for those transitions when it comes to that. Now, the only optical flaw that I can really point to that is an apparent one is that this lens, with so much glass in it, is somewhat flare prone. And I would say, toward being fairly strongly flare prone. And I noticed it not just in the situations where I'm doing my, my torture tests when I'm pointing the camera at the sun, as you see me do, like in these videos, but I saw it show up in videos and videos and shots where I didn't actually even see the sun necessarily in the frame. It was completely out of frame, and I didn't think it was kind of even shining directly, and I would still get a few minor ghosting artifacts. But the ghosting artifacts, even compared to the Samyang, they are definitely more obvious. And the biggest problem is that they're fairly defined. And so with a little bit harder edges on them, which makes them a little bit harder to clean up in post, if that's a problem. And so that would be the only real optical flaw. There were a few very harsh lighting situations where at f1.2 I did see a bit of purple fringing, but it was not pronounced, and I didn't see it outside of the extreme situations. So for regular use, I don't consider that to be a problem. In fact, optically, the lens is awesome. I mean, great color, amazing resolution and sharpness, great contrast, very, very, very good image quality. And so flare being the only true drawback that I can point to. And so at the end of the day, this is a lens, obviously, that is going to be for a specific audience. And so I think you should know going in that if you're going to purchase it, it is going to be a larger and heavier lens, not a lens that you're going to just, throw casually into your bag to bring along. You're going to want to be intentional in bringing it. At the same time, however, unlike some lenses that are just large, it does bring some special qualities. It's better built than probably any of the opposing 35mm lenses on the Sony platform. It's feature rich, it works very well, and that f1.2 aperture allows you to shoot at f1.2 as a portrait photographer and get fabulous results. And so that in and of itself, I think, may make it worthwhile for certain photographers. If you're looking more for a general purpose 35mm lens to do a variety of things with, there might be better options for you that are smaller and more compact. I mean, some might even go for the new Sony 35mm f1.8. Obviously, there's a huge difference in size and difference in price and definitely a difference in maximum aperture, but you kind of need to buy for your actual need. And if you think that you're going to shoot a lot of portraits or shoot events where you will value that f1.2 aperture, then I certainly have no qualms in recommending the Sigma. Just note that it is a large lens, and you're going to have to understand that there are some trade-offs that come with having a large lens. Fortunately, one of those trade-offs is having beautiful, well-corrected optical performance, even on the Sony a7R Mark IV 61 megapixel body that I did a lot of my tests on. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, a lot more photos and samples there. There's also linkage to an image gallery if you just want to look at some pictures. Beyond that, there is also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, linkage to follow me on social media or to become a patron. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.